So when this all breaks in 1774, they're not supporting the company. They are, there's a huge move in Parliament against the company. There are plays being put on. There's headlines. Suddenly, the nabobs are regarded as murderers and villains. But up to this point, Parliament has been very thrilled with the company because it's a very safe investment. A quarter of parliamentarians have shares in the East India Company, growing to I think 40% by 1770. And there is the only resentment felt against the company is not about the plunder and immorality of its actions in India. It's more to do with the fact that it's that people are jealous of these nabobs coming back, rather like people hating the citywide boys in the 80s who were running around in Porsches and spraying champagne around restaurants. So these nabobs are coming back aged 35, buying up parliamentary seats, buying up big country houses around Britain, and there is social resentment against these young men coming back, swaggering, throwing money around, breaking social convention, often from fairly humble backgrounds, and now they're the new rich. So the initial opposition to the company is more social and snobbery than outrage about human rights or anything else. But by 1770, there is genuine outrage at everything. The company is bankrupt, and yet at the same time, the dividends have never been higher, and the amount of money being remitted from India to Britain, I think the same year that 1 million Bengalis died, 1772, 15 million is remitted back. In that day's currency. So add, I think, 10.5 or something to get the current, but it's basically 10 times the sum. So what had been seen to be a very good thing for Britain, had been the country's leading employer, had been the largest payer of tax and customs revenue, suddenly came to be seen as this monstrous, violent force that was somehow involving the country in war crimes and murdering. Horace Walpole, who's a Whig diarist, writes in his diary at this time, "We have outdone the Spanish and the Portuguese in Mexico. They at least had the excuse of faith. We have done this for profit." So suddenly the country wakes up to what's going on. And by 1857, the whole thing is nationalized and becomes the Raj. And then, so there's two very different periods of history when you're dealing with the British in India. The one that has remained in the public eye, and which is whenever you see any movie or any public popular rendition of the Raj, it is Kipling, Curzon, Queen Victoria, Merchant Ivory films with parasols on similar lawns, smiling Maharajas, all that stuff. But that period is only 1858 to 1947. It's only 90 years. And the bit below the waterline, which we rarely see, if ever, in movies. I mean, in Indian popular culture, there's Satyajit Ray, the chess players, 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗎, and Junoon, I suppose. I mean, there's only a couple of movies about this period. That is the company period, there are different pros and cons. I mean, you don't particularly want to be an Indian under either, but they are different in their iniquities. So, the company period is more exploitative, asset stripping, more plunder, more loot, and yet at the same time it's more collaborative. The company intermarries. A third of British men in India are married to Indian women. Most company businessmen will have Indian partners, whether it's in the indigo trade or the opium trade. A lot of the opium trade is in the hands of Parsis out of Bombay, for example. I was in the
drug runners,
narcos, the biggest narco operation in history.
The Parsis.
So I was actually in the headquarters of Jardine Matheson giving this talk 2 nights ago in Hong Kong. Jardine Matheson being the private company which in a sense replaced the company in the 1860s as the center of this opium trade, or 1840s. And at the top of the stairs in the penthouse where I was giving this talk is this huge, massive portrait as large as this, the ceiling to floor in this room, of is he 𝗕𝗿𝗶𝘁𝗶𝘁𝗵, whose name is not particularly familiar, but he's the JJ of the JJ School of Art, and anyone that knows Bombay, all those JJ Hospital, and there's a whole variety of philanthropic organizations, JJ this and JJ that. This is this guy, and that money came from the opium trade. So the company, asset stripping, looting, plundering, ruthless, but collaborative. The Raj, which follows it, which post-1947, is slightly different in that the company makes no pretense to be about anything except profit. I mean, in a sense, it's the attractive quality of it. It doesn't have any cant about building railways and civilizational missions and all that, bullshit. They're there to make a fortune and come home. The Raj, on the contrary, has all this rhetoric about bringing Western civilization to Asia, rescuing the poor benighted natives from Hinduism and all the things that Victorians disapprove of. And they are very racist. They have, the all-white clubs, the no dogs and Indians on the similar road. That's the way of the Raj. And yet they also have, in order to back up their rhetoric of civilizational mission, they build hospitals, they build universities, they build communications. So in 1947, when Britain leaves India with only 7% of world GDP, rather than 43% or whatever it was at the peak, it nonetheless leaves India with the best communications in Asia, the best education system in Asia, and the best health system in Asia. And for the first 20 years of Indian independence, if you're in Singapore or Malaysia, you will send your kids to Delhi to be educated, or just like Afghans go to Delhi hospitals today, because there's nothing in Afghanistan, the Malaysians and everyone. And it's only when, in a sense, the rise of Southeast Asia in the 60s and 70s that ceases. So India, so it's a very mixed, I don't know which is worse or better, the collaborative plunder of the company or the racist civilization mission of the Raj. There are different pros and cons, but they are very different from each other. Say one last thing, which I haven't said. If you were to look for one positive thing from the company, because the company, unlike the Raj, doesn't build roads, communications, universities, schools, certainly not in this period. It does build the railways a little bit later, but that's a later story. What the company does do, and what, in a sense, is its greatest legacy, ironically, is it unites India. And it creates a united Indian army. And so, while India has been a geographical space for millennia, it's also been a cultural space and a spiritual space. Sadhus circumnavigate India from early centuries AD. People know what India means geographically. It has never, until this period, been a united political space. Not with Ashoka, not with the Guptas, not with the Delhi Sultans, not with the Cholas, not with the Mughals. It's the company that first unites this area. And the army it founds is still the basis of the modern Indian army. Regiments like Skinner's Horse, Gardiner's Horse, the Maratha Light Cavalry, all these are still there to this day. That officers' messes still with the cups and the trophies and the pictures of this period. And so if you were to look for, in a sense, one bright outcome from this far from elevating story of loot and plunder, it is that, ironically, India becomes united politically for the first time through this horrible process.